चित्तस्य पदेन वाचां मलं शरीरस्य च वैद्यकेन योपाकरोत्तं प्रवरं मुनीनां पतञ्जलिं प्राञ्जलिरानतोऽस्मि आबाहुपुरुषाकारं शङ्खचक्रासिधारिणं सहस्रशिरसं श्वेतं प्रणमामि पतञ्जलिं हरिः वसुदेवसुतं देवं कंसचाणूरमर्दनं देवकी परमानन्दं कृष्णं वन्दे जगद्गुरुं सर्वोपनिषदो गावो दुग्धा गोपालनन्दनः पार्थो वत्सः सुधीर्भोक्ता दुग्धं गीतामृतं महत्। ॐ शान्तिः शान्तिः शान्तिः। So, in the text of the Bhagavad Gita, also known as the Yoga Shastra, as we find in the end of every chapter, Om Tatsaditi Srimad Bhagavad Gita Su Upanishatsu Brahma Vidyayam Yoga Shastri. Patanjali's Yoga Sutra is often referred to as Yoga Darshana or Yoga Sutra. The aphorisms on yoga and the Bhagavad Gita is referred to as the Yoga Shastra, the scripture on yoga. This is because each chapter of this text is dedicated to one of the principal forms of yoga. In the past 2 years, we studied the second chapter and the third chapter. So this year, we will start with the fourth chapter, which in this book that we have here is on page number 70. But before we start with the fourth chapter, before we study the first shloka, first verse, let us discuss a little bit. Let us just go through a little bit of what was discussed earlier by Sri Krishna, so that we can get the idea, we can get the context, and it will enable us to understand the next verse that we are about to study. The second chapter, of course, the first chapter was about the grief, the pain, the suffering that Arjuna had to go through, his disciple, his student had to go through, which pushed him into looking for something greater, for something meaningful, for something enlightening in his life. So that was referred to as Vishada Yoga. Suffering in life as a means to inspire the search, to inspire a search for that unity, for that yoga. This was the first chapter. Then the second chapter. In the second chapter, what Krishna does, he first starts by explaining the very final essence, the very goal of yoga, which is often referred to by the word Sankhya Yoga or Dhyana Yoga, the knowledge, the yoga of knowledge. Knowledge, wisdom, understanding as a means to acquire yoga in one's life, in which Krishna challenged his student Arjuna to raise above the limited knowledge that one acquires through reading even the most sacred scriptures. Traigunya Vishaya Veda, the Vedas, the most sacred scriptures, the very fountainhead of spirituality as it exists and as it was developed on this Indian subcontinent, even that, because it is part of a very radiant but a manifestation of the mind, which is referred to often as the Sattva Guna, the quality of light, the quality of enlightenment, the quality of knowledge, which resides within the mind. It is still in the realm of the mind. O Arjuna, your goal is Nistraigunya Bhavarjuna. Your goal is to transcend that. Your goal is to go beyond that. So what Krishna really mentions in the second chapter is what Patanjali refers to as asampradhyata samadhi, the very final stage of samadhi. In the understanding of Patanjali, he is really talking about the very final step, the very final stage, the very goal of yoga. But was Arjuna really prepared for that? From the questions that Arjuna asks after the second chapter is over, and after, towards the end of the second chapter, Shri Krishna, this will help you to, while you have the book with you later, if you have the Bhagavad Gita, you can go through those ideas, through those verses, particularly the last 18 verses of the second chapter present in a nutshell the whole quintessence, the complete quintessence of the Bhagavad Gita. There are 18 chapters in the entire book, and there are 18 verses in the last discussion of the second chapter. And these 18 verses were extremely dear to Mahatma Gandhi, who was a great lover and a great devotee of the Bhagavad Gita. He used to recite these 18 chapters every day in his morning and evening prayer meetings. After having discussed all that in front of Arjuna, the question that Arjuna asks, that on one side you are glorifying the path of wisdom, but you are telling me to follow the path of action. So you're glorifying something else, and you are inspiring me to follow something else. Why is it so? If you are glorifying one thing and you are telling me to follow something else, why you are not talking about the same thing? This is what deludes my mind, deludes my understanding. And then Shri Krishna realized that Arjuna needs to be instructed into the glory, into the greatness, into the importance of selfless action, into the importance of action as a means to acquire that wisdom in one's life. That is the reason then, in the 3rd chapter, Shri Krishna started discussing Karma Yoga. Karma, action as a means of yoga, in which, if I would be trying to present it in a nutshell, then in his own words it was tasmadasataha satatam karyam karma samachara, without being attached to its results, always perform the duties that have been appointed to you. Because asakto hyacharan karma, by performing action in such a way, paramapnoti purushaha, a person, a human being, acquires the supreme goal in his own life. The fundamental philosophy of the Vedas and the Upanishads is to take one's duty, one's action as the supreme form of worship. Shri Krishna comes back to this idea again and again. He will culminate by stating the same in the 18th chapter, in the last chapter, Swakarmana tamabhyartya siddhim vindati manavaha. A human being acquires supreme perfection in his life by worshipping the omnipresent divinity through action, through his deeds. So this was the view that was followed and practiced by the visionary kings of ancient India, which are often referred to by a word that we will see being used here in the 2nd verse, Rajarshayaha, which are referred to by the word Rajarshi. And Rajarshi means, Raja means a king, and Rishi means a visionary, a saint, a sage, a great thinker, a wise man. Somebody who understands the transcendental reality, which means somebody who is not deluded by the ever-changing appearances of this reality, the ever-changing names and forms, but can see beyond those names and forms and has a perpetual awareness of that supreme presence, that supreme existence, which is referred to by the Vedic scriptures as Sat. Sat simply means is, that which is, pure existence. Names and forms require that existence to exist. Names and forms change, but that existence remains changeless, like the substratum of a river. The water flows above it, but the riverbed remains the same. When we see a bud in the morning, a flower in the evening, a few petals the next day, a few dried petals the next day, and then after a few days, just a few grains of dust. Every time we refer to it in the present moment, we say, the bud is, the flower is, the few petals are, the dried petals are, the few grains of dust are. Every time, knowingly or unknowingly, we refer to that existence through that verb. is our, which is the same in Sanskrit, us, because all Indo-European languages who were derived from the Proto-Indo-European language have the same root, similar roots that are cognate to each other. And from that root the word Sat has been derived, which is the ultimate existence about which the Vedas proclaim Ekam Sat, that pure existence is one, but, and this is where the Vedic teachings differ a little bit from other monotheistic traditions, that they say Vipraha Bahudha Vadanti, but the wise men express it. When it comes into expression of names and forms, it can be expressed through various names and forms. That is that unity, that oneness within diversity, which is what yoga makes us to set out to find it in the world around us and within us both. So someone who lives in the perpetual awareness of that sacred, we may call it sacred, we may call it holy, we may call it simply a presence, just pure presence, Sat. They don't use any other word, just Sat. Sat simply means is, that which exists. Someone who is in that presence is called a rishi, and if he is a king at the same time, his worldly duties have assigned him the duty of a king and rules his kingdom. This was not the philosopher king of India, but the prophet king of India, the great saintly king of India, that in ancient India it inspired a great lineage of kings that ruled with these principles in their minds, in their hearts, for the well-being of all beings. And that is the idea behind Rajarshi. So this was the view that was followed and practiced by visionary kings such as Janaka, the father of Sita, whose name was mentioned with great respect by Sri Krishna in the 3rd chapter, in the 20th verse, Karmanaiva hi sansiddhimasthita Janakadayaha, Janaka, etc. We hear of so many different kings, such as Ashwapati, the king of Kaikaya, who despite being self-enlightened, decided to remain kings to execute their service for the wider benefit and well-being of the society. What they called Loka Sangraha, the development, the upliftment of the wider public. Loka Sangraha Mevapi. Even if you think that you have become enlightened, Arjuna, your duty to the society does not cease. You still have to work hard for Loka Sangraha, for the benefit of the society, for the well-being of the society. So Karma Yoga, which is the philosophy, even though Sri Krishna mentions various kinds of yoga, he discusses in great detail the 3 aspects, the 3 primary aspects of yoga: Karma Yoga, Bhakti Yoga, and Jnana Yoga. But when it comes to presenting himself as an example, we saw while we were studying the 3rd chapter how he presents himself, that look at me, just look at me, how I work hard. So then, not in Bhakti Yoga, not in Jnana Yoga, but in Karma Yoga, he presents himself as an example to the theory, to the idea. So, yoga, which is understood by the masters as the very quintessential teaching of the Vedas, because the word yoga was coined by the Vedic masters, it has been used in these meanings by the Vedic masters in the most ancient texts, the Rig Veda, and in other Vedas as well. So under the heading of yoga, what the yogic masters really did, they tried to present, because the literature, the vast literature of the Vedas was so huge that not a single person, back then it was impossible for a single person to study this entire literature. Even today, the Vedic literature, the very foundational literature of spirituality in India is so vast that it cannot be studied by one single person. But what the yogic masters did, under the word yoga, they really tried to bring together the very core concepts, the most important concepts of the Vedic teachings. This is what the Bhagavad Gita does, the text that we have. That is the reason it has become the most important text, even though it belongs to the second grade of texts, because the Vedas belong to the first grade, which are considered supreme authority in themselves by Hindu traditions. And the Bhagavad Gita belongs to a group of texts that are considered authoritative only because what they say is completely in accordance of the Vedas. So their authority rests on the authority of the Vedas. The same is true about Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. That also belongs to this second group of texts. That is the reason Patanjali, to bolster his position, to show his authenticity, has to refer to the Vedas in the very beginning of his Yoga Sutras. So the quintessence of the Vedic teachings, which was presented in the form of yoga, the entire message of the Vedic teaching is actually completely covered under these two words, Karma Yoga and Dhyana Yoga. After Krishna has discussed these two ideas, the idea of Karma Yoga, the means to which Patanjali refers to as Kriya Yoga in the beginning of the second chapter, Tapasvardhyayeshvara Pranidhanani Kriya Yoga, yoga through action, which he then develops further into asana, pranayama, pratyahara, all these practices which are included under Kriya Yoga, under the wider understanding of Kriya Yoga, all comes under Karma Yoga, and then the meditative aspect of yoga, which comes under Dhyana Yoga. And in these two, because that is basically what the Vedas are all about. This is what Shankaracharya, the commentator on this verse, points out, that yoyam yogo adhyaya dvaina uktaha. He does not say the two yogas that have been mentioned in two chapters, but he says the one yoga that has been mentioned in both chapters. And this is something that the masters always keep on emphasizing. They prefer to use the word yoga in its singular form rather than the dual or plural forms, because for them yoga is one, and whatever we refer to as the various forms of yoga, they are just various facets, various techniques, various practices, various understandings, various presentations by various masters of yoga. Yasmin Vedartha Parisamaptaha, in which the significance, the quintessence of the Vedas has been covered. So, concluded, finished, everything that Krishna was basically wanted to speak about was covered by him in the second chapter and in the third chapter. And so now what he is doing at the beginning of the fourth chapter is actually winding up his discourse. This is what we will see. He starts winding up his discourse and starts telling the Vamsha, the pedigree, the tradition, the lineage of the knowledge which he has mentioned earlier. He gives us some great names who have practiced, who have lived, who have made this philosophy, this ideology, a living practice. He gives us a few names. This was a tradition in ancient India. We find this practice being practiced in all ancient Vedic texts, particularly in the Upanishads. In the culminating chapters of the Upanishads, we always find a very long list of the masters, which forms the core tradition of that wisdom, and which tells us that how through a living lineage of living masters this wisdom has reached us. This used to serve at least three purposes. First of all, it was considered a gesture of great thankfulness, which is considered extremely important, what we call in Sanskrit kritajnata. Kritajnata means to express gratitude to someone who has done something for us. So by mentioning their names, by remembering their names, we express our gratitude to them. So this is the first purpose. The second purpose is that the names of these great masters and personalities mentioned in the tradition give authenticity to that knowledge, tell us that it has been practiced by such great personalities, by living people. It also helps us to preserve our ancient history, because with those names, stories related to those great masters come down to us, which inspire newcomers to yoga. And it makes the knowledge a living knowledge. And this is the reason that the Vedic traditions lay a great emphasis on receiving knowledge from a living teacher who is connected to an unbroken chain of masters. And this is what sets apart the Vedic tradition from other religions that came into existence, which broke away from the Vedic traditions, such as Buddhism, Jainism, Sikhism, various religions which broke away from the Vedic traditions, which rejected this idea. But in the Vedic traditions, and that is the reason the Vedic traditions never became centered around a single person. It's just simply not possible. Because the tradition is kept alive, the name of all those masters, however, with great devotion we might refer to Bhagwan Patanjali, but he can never become all and everything of yoga, because he himself was a student of yoga and he received that teaching from his own mother, Gonika, who is often referred to as a great yogini. So yes, he is extremely important because he has systematically presented the philosophy of yoga in a very concise, scientific, mathematical, precise way. That is a great contribution, and he is the first author to do this 2,600 or 400 years ago. But that doesn't make him the central person. There is nothing like a central person in any of the traditions. So, by this successive lineage of masters, the wisdom remains alive, because when every new master who enters the tradition gives a new dimension to that wisdom from his own practice. This is what Guruji did. He practiced it himself, he instilled those teachings in his life, and he contributed immensely to something that was already immensely developed. But as time changes, as the space changes, everything changes, our frontiers of knowledge keep on increasing, and a new understanding of yoga, a renewed understanding of yoga, a renewed understanding of everything that we discuss, make this wisdom again and again fresh, renew it. This is what the masters do by first practicing it themselves. So yes, scriptures are great reservoirs of knowledge. If Patanjali's Yoga Sutras would not have been there, we might not have seen that depth in Guruji's life which was given to him by the Yoga Sutras and by the Bhagavad Gita. But in those texts, these texts are often referred to as an ocean, and not everything in an ocean is relevant for everybody. A particular thing might be meaningful only to a particular person. For everybody else, it might be completely meaningless. All that wisdom has been accumulated. A lot of it might be meaningless for a person in our stage of development, might become meaningful at a later stage, might never become meaningful for me, but would become meaningful for someone else. But the master, a living master, who lives the core of that wisdom in his own life and tasted the knowledge through his own experience, has the capacity to present what is most relevant in that particular place for that particular person or for that particular group of people in that particular time. This is the reason there is so much emphasis on this unbroken chain of lineage in which the wisdom is received from a living master and not from lifeless books. Lifeless books become just a tool of discussion, but in those discussions, the masters provide the keys to unlock some of the most obscure, meaningless, seemingly childish sentences that we come across, particularly in some of the deepest texts, such as the Vedas. Often if you just look at a translation of the Rig Veda, many of these hymns seem childish, meaningless. But after the key has been acquired, then the depth of those sentences is understood. So, with keeping this introduction in our mind, Karma Yoga and Dhyana Yoga, these two discussions that Sri Krishna talked about in the second and the third chapter, which Patanjali refers to as Karma Yoga, he refers to as Kriya Yoga in the beginning of the second chapter, and Dhyana Yoga he refers to when he discusses Ashtanga Yoga, the 8 limbs of yoga, Yoganga Anushtanat, by the practice of the 8 limbs of yoga, Yama, Niyama, Asana, Pranayama, etc., Ashuddhikshay, which are seen by Patanjali essentially as purificatory practices, as practices that purify our being on a social level through the yamas, on a personal level through the niyamas, on a physical level through the asanas, on a pranic level through the pranayama, on the level of the senses through pratyahara, on the level of the mind and the intellect through the practices of dharana, dhyana and samadhi. All these practices are seen essentially as purificatory practices. When these purificatory practices are practiced, he says that the wisdom that is present within us, within ourselves, at the very core of our being, that wisdom is enlightened. That wisdom shines forth. And this is an idea that Patanjali presents again and again. And this lies at the core of the Vedic teaching, that what we find in the Vedas, all this deep wisdom, is nothing exotic, is nothing that has been discovered or concocted or created by these great masters, but it exists actually within every human being. At the core of every human being, it's just a matter of entering that core. It's just a matter of entering that inner sacred chamber. It is just a matter of meditating and purifying one's mind, removing the soot, so that the lamp that is eternally burning within can shine forth its light, its radiance can enlighten all our life. So this is what he refers to by jnana diptihi. Then as a result of that, jnana, the living wisdom, what he refers to as taraka jnana, not the type of wisdom that is acquired by reading scriptures, which nonetheless is a great means, but he's not talking about that. He's talking about what comes out from within as a result of practice on one side and as a result of accumulating the wisdom of the scriptures in one's life, the wisdom that a person discovers within. The intellect which he refers to as ridambhara prajna, the intellect that has the capacity to hold within it the supreme truth, the universal law, the universal truth. All these words he used. I'm just comparing terms to create a dialogue between Patanjali's Yoga Sutra and Sri Krishna's Yoga Shastra, who essentially are speaking about the same thing, but because they use slightly different terms. And Sanskrit is a very lucid language, is a very supple language, is a very elastic language. Simply using a few terms doesn't change anything. But translators, when they translate, when we read Sanskrit as a second language, not as a first language, often we become perplexed and we become confused by this use of different terms, but which in a sense speak of the same thing. So let us pronounce the first verse of the 4th chapter. I will pronounce one word and then you can follow me. Shri Bhagavan Uvacha Imam Vivasvate Yogam Proktavan Ahamavyayam Vivaswan Manave Praha Manur Ikshvakave Bravit Shri Bhagavanu Vacha Imam Vivasvate Yogam Proktavanahamavvyayam Vivaswan Manave Praha Manurikshvakave Bravit. So, Imam Vivasvate Yogam Proktavan Ahamavyayam. O Arjuna, this imperishable yoga, this yoga which is avyaya, which is imperishable, because it has been discovered by reaching the very imperishable core of one's being, the pure consciousness that resides, the pure consciousness, the contentless consciousness, the pure consciousness that is devoid of the multiplicity that it enlightens, but consciousness per se, not consciousness about something, because consciousness always seems to point at something else. It is like a vessel that always contains within it something else, a name and a form. It's always about something. It's always about a word. It's always about a form. It's always about a tree, about the form of the tree, about the name of the tree. It's always about a name and a form. But we are not concerned with all those changing names and forms, but that which gives meaning, that which something so radically different within our core, which enables us to cognize, which enables us to understand, which enables us to comprehend the tree, which enables us to give it a name, which enables us to do all this. That consciousness in itself, without the tree, without anything else. It is because in the experience of that consciousness, that imperishable reality within, the masters have discovered this wisdom, this jnana yoga, and the path to acquire it, karma yoga. Therefore, Krishna refers to it as the imperishable yoga, avyaya yoga. How does he translate it? Immortal yoga. Well, mortals are beings, and immortal, that's what he means, imperishable. But mortal are beings. Yoga cannot be mortal. Yoga can be perishable. So immortal, rather than immortal, I would prefer the translation imperishable. Imam vivasvate yogam proktavanaham avyayam. This yoga was spoken by me. Now, here Sri Krishna does not refer, when he uses the word me, in his highest state of experience, Krishna does not refer to that particular name and form which came into existence with his birth and ceased to exist after he left this planet. He does not mean that name, he does not mean that form, but when he uses the word aham, when he uses the word me, what he means is that pure consciousness within, which is the ultimate source of all knowledge, which is the witness of all knowledge, the knower of all knowledge, because knowledge, which is something that has been created, something that comes as a result when the mind works with the external world, or when the mind works with the internal reality. It creates an understanding, and the reality at its core, which is its witness, pure consciousness itself, this is what he refers to by the word I. And that is always seen as the supreme master in the yogic traditions. This is what Patanjali refers to as the Purvesham api Guruhu, Kalena Navachedat. He is the master of even the most ancient masters. That pure consciousness is the supreme master of all ancient masters, Kalena Navachedat, because that is the only master that is not limited by time and space. That is the master that resides within every being. That is the master that every being has the supreme right to refer to it as I, because it is the very core of what we understand by I. We are highly confused by what we mean by this word I. Sometimes we say I walk, then we think that by this I mean my legs. Sometimes I say I grasp, I think I mean my hands. Sometimes I see or I hear. This is what I say, as if my eyes are myself. Sometimes I say I think, in which I believe that my mind is me. But on the other hand, then I say, my eyes, which means I'm something else. My eyes are different from me. My legs, my hands. So we live in this perpetual confusion. What I really is. Sometimes it includes everything. Sometimes it excludes everything. But once a person settles the meaning of aham, the meaning of what I really means, when the masters use the word I, when a master, a self-enlightened master like Sri Krishna, when he uses the word I, when the master of the Vedas, when he uses the word, when he or she uses the word aham in the Vedas, they don't mean something what we mean, but that very core principle which exists. They are identifying with that. And therefore, Sri Krishna says that I gave this wisdom, which means that pure consciousness, the source of this entire creation, gave this philosophy, gave this practice, gave this knowledge, first of all, to Vivaswan. Vivaswan is considered in all the Vedic traditions the first child of that supreme existence and also the first master of this knowledge, this wisdom. In what sense? Vivaswan, what does Vivaswan mean? Vivaswate. To Vivaswan, what does it mean? Vivas means light. And Vivaswan means someone who is endowed with light. The source of light and life in this creation, which obviously refers to the sun. So the word Vivaswan means the sun. In the Vedic traditions, which have been developed by meditating upon the sources of light as they exist on three levels, the source of light on a physical, on this earthly level in the form of the fire, the source of light in the intermediate level in the form of thunderbolt, and the source of light and life in the form of the sun, in the heavenly source of light. By meditating upon that light, this wisdom of the Vedas was discovered. So always the Vedic masters refer to the sun as the supreme master of the Vedic traditions. Krishna says, this sun, which gave the teaching to the great masters, the great Vedic masters, who was it that taught his wisdom to it? That was me, that consciousness. We see the sun rising every day on its assigned time, traveling from the east to the west, selflessly bestowing life and light on the entire creation. This action of selfless deeds, and that by meditating upon the properties of light as experienced by the masters of the Vedic masters, they could understand the nature of consciousness, or rather than understanding it, because they never actually claim to have fully understood it, but rather explore the dilemma, explore the strange nature of consciousness through exploring the essence of light. But this wisdom was given to me, was given by me to this source of life and light upon the earth. So this sun does not teach in words. Only ignorant people like us, like me, like all of us, require teaching in words. Great masters prefer to teach in action than in words. They only teach in words when they realize that actions are not making any difference. The sun has no need of teaching in words. It teaches in action. The wind teaches in action. The flowing river, Ganga, teaches in action, teaches through her deeds. If you want to see the beautiful message a river gives and how it can bestow supreme enlightenment upon someone searching for light in life, I think the most beautiful book is Hermann Hesse's Siddhartha, who beautifully presents how Siddhartha became enlightened by receiving teaching and wisdom from an ever-flowing river. So this is how the Vedic teachings were received. If we look at, for example, Adiguru Dattatreya, one of the first masters in a tradition, Dattatreya, who has been mentioned in the scriptures, he did not have a living master, but he learned from various beings, various creatures. He learned by observing nature. So this principle of Karma Yoga was taught by the sun to Vivaswan Manavedikaha. Vivaswan, the sun, imparted this teaching to Manu. Manu is a Sanskrit word that more than we actually realize, it is an extremely pervasive word in languages, in all Indo-European languages. Because the Germanic base of the word man in English, if you go back to its root, it is derived from the same. If you look at the Oxford Dictionary, for example, and you look up the word man, you see that it has been related to the Sanskrit word man. It means someone who thinks, because it is derived from the Indo-Germanic root men or mon, which means to think. In Sanskrit, the root is man, from which the word manas or the English word mind has been derived. They are interconnected words. Humans in Sanskrit are called manushya. Sometimes they are called manu, sometimes they are called manushya. Why? Because they are the only animals that can think about the consequences of their deeds, the results of their deeds for themselves and for the wider society. This capacity, it seems, only human beings have. This is what sets them apart from the animal kingdom, nothing else. And this is what the word manushya means. Matvasi vyadi karmani ti manushya. Vedic grammarians such as Maharshi Yaska, 6th century BC, gives this definition of the word manushya for humanity. And it is in this sense that we might think spiritual history of India sees Manu as an ancestor and tells us that we are called humans, we are called manushya, we are called manava. The Hindi word for human beings is manava. Manava means children of Manu. That's what it means. So the spiritual history of India tells us that he is what Adam was to the Judaic traditions. He is to the dharmic religions, the first human being. But interestingly, the Vedas simply use the word just for a human being. When they tell in their teachings, Manurbhava, become a human being. That's all. They don't tell us to become something else. They just tell us to become a human being. Manurbhava, become a Manu. And how does a person become that? Tantum Tanvan, they say Tantum Tanvan, by performing good deeds, by sacrificing one's interests for others. Rajaso Bhanumanvihi, follow the light which enlightens this world. Jyotishmataha patho rakshadhiya kradan, and then protect with all your might the paths that lead towards that light, which have been created by those who had a deep insight into that supreme light. Do everything to protect and propagate that noble path towards that omnipresent light. Anulbanam vayata joguvamapo, and may that light render the acts of its followers, of its devotees, those that aspire, tamasoma jyotirgamaya, help me to come from darkness into light. Free them from their defects, manurbhava. Become a human being, janaya daivyam janam, and produce divine progeny. Daivyam janam, create, give rise, give birth to enlightened beings. This is what the masters do. They give birth to enlightened beings. Because they themselves are enlightened, all those who come into their presence, they taste that light, which is actually the light that is already within each one of them. Before that, a person, even a human being, in the Vedic scriptures is often referred to by the word pashu. Pashu, which is the Sanskrit word for animal. But pashu simply, it is derived from the word pasha. Pasha means bondage. Pasha means snare. Someone that is bound with the snare of ignorance. Somebody who is bound by the snare of darkness, who rejects light. Such is pashu. So Manu, that sun, that light that is up there, it speaks to the Manu that is within us. Manu is not only an ancestor, not an ancestor whose few genes might be left in our physical body. But when the Vedas speak of the Manu, they speak of the Manu that resides now within us, the human being, the humanity within myself, within each one of us. Of course, as far as the spiritual history of the Vedic traditions exist, every religion has this mythology of the great deluge. The Babylonian culture, ancient Greece, Mesopotamia, the Judaic religions. Even just think the Aztecs and the American Indians had this, which tells us that this must have been an extremely ancient mythology, which already existed in the time when all these people went away from a common source, but they took their own versions of that mythology. The name of Manu goes back to that mythology because Manu is the person, the only human being who was saved in that great deluge. So according to that account, Manu would be the Hindu counterpart of Noah in the biblical tradition, Nuh in Islam. However, that is the mythological aspect, that is the spiritual history aspect. The most important is the Manu that is within us, that resides within us. But nonetheless, the Vedas also refer to him. Sometimes they refer to him as Manushpita, Manu, the father. He's credited to have been the original founder of Ayurveda also, because Yani Manuravrinita Pitanaha, the herbs that were known to our father, to our forefather, the Manu. This is how the Rig Veda refers to it. And he's also credited to have been the original, ultimate founder of the path of yoga, Yasya Dwara, who opened the path, the Dwara, the door. Dwara means door. Manushpita, our father Manu, Deveshu Dhiya Anaje, who opened the door of action and wisdom. Dhiya means action, Dhiya also means knowledge. To find the source within, he who opened the door for us. Such Manu, the father. So he is often referred to ancient traditions. For example, Patanjali's yoga tradition goes back, Ashtanga yoga tradition goes back to Kapila. Kapila was the son of Devahuti. Kapila is considered again the first master of the Sankhya yoga tradition. His mother was Devahuti. Devahuti was the daughter of Manu. So there are so many accounts that go back to Manu in the spiritual history of India. So the sun gave this wisdom to Manu, and Manu Rikshvakave Bravit. Manu gave this wisdom to his son Ikshvaku. Ikshvaku, many people when I was in Israel, they were telling me that Ikshvaku, at least the name itself, has a relationship with Ishaq in the biblical traditions. That's what they pointed out to me. It would not have had occurred to me, but they were keen. There are, I think, a group of people in Israel who try to relate everything to the 12 lost tribes, and so they try to relate Ikshvaku to Ishaq. In any case, Ikshvaku is in the Hindu traditions. He is the son of Manu and Shraddha, who is also considered the first ruler, the first king in Indian mythology. He has been mentioned also in various scriptures in the Rig Veda. I will not go through all that. But what I think is meaningful to us is that when this wisdom is received by the human being within us, this mythology, this history has to repeat itself in ourselves. And that is when the first king, that is when the first ruler is produced within us, which means that is when we become able, from a slave of ourselves, we become a ruler, a noble, a just ruler of our senses, of our emotions, of our inclinations. So when we speak of the first ruler, Ikshvaku, the one who tastes the juice of sugarcane, this is the literal meaning of the word Ikshvaku, because it has been derived from Ikshu. All these tiny little things add so much to the esoteric hidden meaning of these mythological stories, which are by many people considered to be the true history of our, or prehistorical history of our nation. But at the same time, when we understand their meaning, they become meaningful on a very different level in the present moment. Because if Ikshvaku was a great king back then, fine, I have heard his name, I pay my respect to him, with that it finishes. How does he benefit me today? If he tells me about the first ruler that I become of my senses for the first time, through the practice of asana, I gain control over my body. Through the practice of pranayama, when I gain control over my prana, then through the practice of pratyahara, when I gain control over my senses, and through the practice of meditation, when I gain control of the various dimensions of my mind, when I become that king of myself, when I reclaim my lost kingdom, and I become for the first time the king of this kingdom, that is when the Ikshvaku is produced within me. And this wisdom is received by him as well. So these mythological characters, they are historical characters. At the same time, when we look at them, the time is limited. But when we look at them, when we go deeper into them, when we bring together the entire yogic understanding and Vedic mythology, we find these deep layers beneath the mythology that, if it was created, then has been created out of the yogic principles by the masters. This is how yoga actually pervades everything. Yoga pervades the rituals of Hinduism. Yoga pervades the traditions of Hinduism. Yoga pervades the philosophy of Hinduism. Yoga pervades the mythology of Hinduism. Yoga pervades and forms the foundation of everything that is there. The time is over. My plan originally was to talk a little bit about the Navaratra festival also, which is going on, and see how that is related to the yogic principles. Then, of course, tomorrow is the birthday of Mahatma Gandhi, whose name we should never forget, who gave great inspiration to the whole world through his movement, through his non-violent movement for political freedom and justice, who inspired great leaders such as Martin Luther King and Nelson Mandela, who himself found inspiration on a daily basis from the Bhagavad Gita. He was heard often to be saying that when doubts haunt me, when disappointments stare me in the face, and I see not one ray of hope on the horizon, I turn to Bhagavad Gita and find a verse that comforts me, and I immediately begin to smile in the midst of overwhelming sorrow. Those who meditate on the Gita will derive fresh joy and new meaning from it every single day when they read it. And this is what he did. The entire non-violent movement for freedom in India was every day from the start of it, Bala Gangadhar Tilak, the first person who proclaimed the idea of independence from the British rule, up to Mahatma Gandhi, the last person, found their inspiration in the Bhagavad Gita. It is an irony that the same nation after independence, simply because it believes in secularity, which is a beautiful idea, but rejected the teaching of the Bhagavad Gita in its educational system. That was an irony. However, tomorrow is Gandhiji's birthday, so we pay our homage and respect to him also. And day after tomorrow is Vijayadashmi, which is the culmination of these 9 days of fasting, particularly this time because the Prime Minister of India himself was fasting. So while he met Barack Obama, he only drank water. So that brought this fasting in all the international media, that actually Hindus fast during these days. Mostly these fasts are practiced especially by the mothers and sisters of India. Of course, every religious person does, but mothers and sisters are more serious about their traditions and their religion in India than men. So these 9 days, which is actually to celebrate the power of consciousness which resides within all beings, Chitirupena ya Kritsname tad vyapya jagat sthita, this power of consciousness which pervades all beings. Namastasya, 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 namo namaha. Not only in this form, but in the form of Chetana, in the form of physical power, in the form of beautiful virtues such as forgiveness, peace, faith, Shraddha, then compassion, and then Tushti, which means contentment. In the form of all those virtues, the power that exists, that power is worshipped, meditated upon, and fasting is performed as a cleansing ritual, as a cleansing technique. So these 9 days culminate in Vijayadashmi, in the 10th day, which symbolizes victory over evil. Evil always stands for the darkness of ignorance in whatever form it might be. May it be Mahishasura, may it be the 10-headed Ravana. What all that symbology means, the time is no more there to discuss that. But this will be celebrated day after tomorrow. That is a very important celebration in Hinduism. The most important celebration for Hindus in Nepal. In Nepal it is the Christmas. It is the Christmas of the year. It is the most important celebration for Nepali Hindus. In India, in Mysore, where Krishnamacharya developed the path of yoga, it is celebrated all over India. It will be celebrated here. Also in Rishikesh, it will be celebrated. It is celebrated everywhere. But the festival of Vijayadashmi is specifically famous of Mysore in South India and of Kullu in North India, in Himachal Pradesh. So like this, that is the cultural aspect. All these festivals are again deeply related to the yogic principles, but all that is a matter of discussion. Let us conclude with this today's class. We'll have a few moments of meditation just to assimilate what we have discussed. If there is still any question, I'm available after the class. सर्वे भवन्तु सुखिनः, सर्वे सन्तु निरामयाः, सर्वे भद्राणि पश्यन्तु, मा कश्चित् दुःखभाग् भवेत्। ॐ शान्तिः शान्तिः शान्तिः। Sarve bhavantu sukhinah. May all always be happy and blissful. Sarve santu niramayah. May all be free from sickness and pain and suffering. Sarve bhadrani pashyantu. May everyone experience only what is auspicious and beneficial for all. Ma kaschit dukkha bhag bhavet. May no one experience sorrow and suffering in their lives. Om Shantihi Shantihi Shantihi. Om Peace Peace Peace. Thank you.